While primarily known as the Rolling Stones founder, Brian Jones was also a gifted multi-instrumentalist, prominently featured throughout the material of their early blues rock era, as well as a collaborator on other artists' work throughout the 60s. But on July 3, 1969, Jones's career was cut short. The official report was that he drowned to death at just 27 years old, but the death has been questioned by some as being more sinister than was initially reported. That's what we're going to explore in today's video. Although Jones was raised on classical music, he gradually took an interest in Southern American blues artists as a teenager, among them Robert Johnson and Elmore James. In 1957, at age 15, he'd also become influenced by jazz after hearing Cannonball Adderley for the first time, going as far as convincing his parents to buy him a saxophone. Then 2 years later, he'd receive an acoustic guitar for his 17th birthday and began supporting himself by busking around Europe, while supplementing that with odd jobs. After playing with a handful of bands, Jones placed an ad in the publication Jazz News calling for auditions and held them at the Bricklayers Arms pub. The first to audition for the band was Blues Incorporated pianist Ian Stewart and eventually singer Mick Jagger, alongside his childhood friend guitarist Keith Richards, both members of the Blues Boys. The group bonded over blues records, and one particular album ended up inspiring their name. In the book, According to the Rolling Stones, Keith Richards mentions how Brian coined the name spontaneously while placing another want ad in the same paper, saying, "Brian was on the phone talking to them. We'd like to place an ad. We're available for work. You can call us at..." The voice on the other end of the line obviously said, "What are you called?" The Best of Muddy Waters album was lying on the floor, and track 5, side 1 was Rollin' Stone Blues, so the band's name was picked for us by Muddy Waters, he'd say. After several bassist tryouts, the band ultimately chose Bill Wyman for his resourcefulness, as well as drummer Charlie Watts, and the band's lineup was solidified in January of 1963. The band would end up establishing a friendship with Beatles one-time publicist Andrew Loog Oldham, who brought Eric Easton, a veteran show business agent 16 years his senior. Both were impressed by the band, and given Oldham's persuasiveness and penchant for trends, and Easton's seasoned business acumen, the pair were the Rolling Stones' much-needed catalyst. Brian Jones would facilitate meetings with Oldham and Easton to discuss management, and by May 1st, the Stones signed on with their management company, Impact Sound. Oldham, meanwhile, enacted his influence on the band by shaping up their image. Initially, he had them wear suits, marketing them as a contender to the Beatles. Decca Records would take a chance on the band, and once they released their self-titled debut album on April 16, 1964, his approach worked in their favor. The album peaked at number 1 on the UK charts, becoming one of the year's bestsellers, and its eventual US release would include the header, England's Newest Hitmakers. In addition, the Stones would beat the Beatles in 2 favorability surveys, and their second album, Rolling Stones No. 2, released on January 15, 1965, would match the success of their debut, once again reaching the number 1 spot on the UK Top 40 charts. Both albums predominantly featured early rock and R&B covers. While the first album featured 1 original song, Tell Me You're Coming Back, the follow-up would feature 3, including What a Shame, Growin' Up Wrong, and Off the Hook, all of them written by Jagger and Richards. Oldham noted the pair's budding output of original music on subsequent releases, and while Brian Jones would still contribute plenty in terms of arrangements and instrumentation, he gradually found himself out of step with the band's continued growth. Besides Oldham replacing Jones as band leader, he would also have greater influence on the band's musical direction, with Jones' strong suit, blues, and R&B material becoming much less prioritized. Additionally, the dynamic of their live shows changed, putting the spotlight on Mick Jagger's flamboyant charisma. These changes, combined with the surplus of money and fame from the band's success, would exacerbate his use of drugs and alcohol, which made him moody and at times even antisocial. Bill Wyman would take note of Jones's change in behavior and stand alone, saying, "There were at least 2 sides to Brian's personality. One Brian was introverted, shy, sensitive, deep-thinking. The other was a preening peacock, gregarious, and desperately needing assurance from his peers." By March of 1967, Jones's relationship with his bandmates became especially strained. His trip with Jagger and Richards to Morocco would provide him with some breathing room, and he'd become fascinated with exotic instruments, but this did little to alleviate his erratic behavior. His last albums with the Stones would be 1968's Beggar's Banquet, and he had some minor credits on the following year's Let It Bleed. Following the release of Let It Bleed, Jones had officially been dismissed from the Stones, and he would be replaced by 20-year-old guitarist Mick Taylor. It was after his dismissal from the group, Jones would retreat to his Cotchford farmhouse in East Sussex, which he'd purchased back in November of '68. his former bandmate Alexis Corner from his early days had gone to visit him, seeing that Jones was, and I quote, happier than he'd ever been, even playing him some demos from a band he'd planned to put together. But Jones's return to music wouldn't come to fruition. It was during his time at his East Sussex property that he would hire former Stones minder Tom Keylock, and one of the tasks Keylock was given was to do some renovations on the property. It resulted in him hiring a man named Frank Thorogood, who ran a construction company. But in reality, little work was done on the property, and Thorogood and his crew exploited Jones's wealth, living on the property and partying. Things would eventually sour between Jones and Thorogood over money. It was alleged that Jones had paid the contractor £18,000 for his work, but Thorogood wanted another £6,000. Then on the night of June 3, 1969, Jones hosted a small party with his girlfriend Anna Wolin, as well as a nurse named Janet Lawson and the contractor Frank Thorogood. It was around midnight that Jones's body was found at the bottom of the swimming pool. By the time the doctors arrived on the scene, Jones was declared dead. The coroner's report ruled Jones' circumstances death by misadventure and found that both his liver and heart were enlarged as a result of constant drug and alcohol abuse. The official police report claimed there were several witnesses at Jones's home that night, but the problem was each witness told differing stories of what happened. One theory is that the police were behind the death of the former Stones member. Jones and his former bandmates were long harassed by a conservative police sergeant from Scotland Yard named Norman Pilcher. Jones's death would be good PR for the police to show the dangers of embracing the counterculture. It's important to note that Vice would report that Pilcher in 1972 was charged with perjury and would serve 4 years in prison. It was speculated that perhaps he was involved in the same drug trade he was trying to police, something he's long denied. The more common theory is that someone at the party was responsible for Jones's death. The nurse friend Janet Lawson would claim she saw Jones and Thorogood go into the pool together after drinking and taking drugs. However, she would change her story when she spoke to a private investigator years later. The autopsy made no note of drugs in Jones's system, and Lawson would later state that Thorogood and Jones were horsing around in the pool, and Thorogood may have accidentally killed Jones. But given their tense relationship regarding the repairs and money, Thorogood had a bone to pick. It was rumored that Thorogood, who died in 1993, made a deathbed confession to Tom Keylock that he killed Jones, saying, and I quote, "It was me that did Brian, I just finally snapped." Some reports, however, claim the opposite, with Keylock being the main suspect. In 2009, Reuters reported that Stone's former road manager Sam Cutler claimed Keylock was responsible for Jones's death and that he coaxed a confession out of Thorogood on his deathbed. Cutler would claim that Keylock was acting suspiciously in the days following Jones's death and that he destroyed some of Jones' belongings, including documents, and ended up with Jones's Rolls Royce. Cutler would cite a private investigator hired by Stone's former manager Alan Klein, who had no faith in the police's investigation. Cutler would claim Keylock was named as the main suspect in that private investigation. While the official police report named 3 people at the property that night, Keylock claimed he was at the party that night in an interview done in 2009 by investigative journalist Terry Rawlings. He would tell Rawlings, and I quote, "What people don't know is that very strong hash cakes were made. That's why they were all stoned and they didn't know what day it was." Keylock claimed he was the only one who didn't partake in the drugs that night, and he would name Thorogood as being behind Jones's death, claiming his brother Frank Keylock, who was a senior officer at Scotland Yard, was told that Jones's death was ordered to be a cover-up because the local police made so many mistakes, recalling, "I think the police wanted to make a manslaughter charge, but they were told to forget it. The only one who could possibly have been charged was Frank Thorogood because he was the only one in the pool, but the police said just forget it. The orders came from the very top not to pursue it anymore, and it was never pursued after that." There was one piece of evidence, though, from the coroner's report that stated that the rock star had fresh water in his lungs. There was quite a bit of fresh water on his property, and he may have been drowned somewhere else and then been thrown into the pool by the perpetrator. In the book Rolling Stone, The Life and Death of Brian Jones, the author of the book would have several biologists review the stresses on Jones's tissue and heart, which pointed to an indication that the musician was fighting for his life and may have been murdered. Another theory is that Jagger and Richards were behind the death, and they had paid Jones a visit to get him to sign over the rights to the Stones' name, but this theory hasn't been investigated very much. Then on June 5, 1969, during a free concert in Hyde Park, the Rolling Stones would pay tribute to Jones while introducing their new guitarist Mick Taylor. In 1989, Jones was posthumously inducted along with the rest of the Rolling Stones into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, with Mick Jagger stating that his, and I quote, "individuality and musicianship often took us off the bluesy course with some often marvelous results." That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. We'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.